December 17th, 1944. The night was silent except for the wind cutting through the pines of the Ardennes. Frost coated the earth like glass, crunching under the weight of men and metal. A Tiger tank, its massive frame looming in the gray pre-dawn haze, shuddered once, twice, and died. The engine coughed, sputtered, then went still. Steam drifted from the exhaust like breath from a dying beast. Standartenführer Jochen Peiper slammed his fist against the hatch, the metallic clang echoing through the frozen stillness. Below him, his driver shouted that the Maybach engine had lost pressure. Peiper leaned down, the cold slicing through his gloves. "Try again." The engine groaned, but refused to live. The fuel gauge needle rested against the bottom. Empty. Inside the steel coffin, panic simmered. "Reserve tank?" Peiper barked. The reply came thin and cracked. "Also dry." The words cut through the dark like a verdict. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint ticking of cooling metal and the distant rustle of the forest, whispering through the fog. Peiper climbed out onto the turret, his breath rising in white clouds. Around him, the armored column stretched down the narrow forest road, half buried in frost and silence. Dozens of vehicles stood motionless, their engines cold, their crews pacing like ghosts in the pale half-light. Headlights were covered, fires forbidden. The air smelled of oil, diesel, and despair. A young radio operator approached, boots crunching through the snow. "Herr Standartenführer," he began, his voice trembling. "The fuel convoy never arrived. The Americans ambushed it near Stavelot." Peiper's jaw clenched. He had ordered the attack to push west at all costs, to reach the Meuse by nightfall, to crack open the Allied front like an egg. Now his spearhead was stranded, its teeth dulled by empty tanks. He turned, scanning the endless line of stalled armor, the pride of the Waffen-SS, frozen in place. Somewhere behind, the distant thud of artillery echoed faintly, a grim reminder that time was slipping away. His officers waited in the snow, their faces pale beneath their helmets. One muttered, "The offensive will die here." Peiper's eyes flashed. "No," he hissed. "We move forward. We take fuel from the Americans. If we have to drag it from their dead hands, we'll have it." But even as he spoke, the cold truth pressed against him like the wind. The dream of a swift, crushing blow was bleeding out on this frozen road. He looked back at his dead Tiger, its turret glistening with ice, its insignia half buried in frost. Around him, men stamped their feet, shivering, cursing softly into the dark. Somewhere in the trees, a crow cried, a sound sharp and hollow as the crack of distant gunfire. Peiper exhaled slowly, the breath leaving his body in a ghostly cloud. "Get the men ready," he said finally. "We march." The words hung in the frozen air, heavy as iron. The Tiger's great bulk stood behind him, lifeless and cold, a monument to the fading strength of the Reich, trapped in the heart of a forest that would be remembered long after the men were gone. Peiper climbed down from the turret, boots sinking into the frost-hardened mud. His breath came out in clouds as he surveyed the column stretching behind him. Rows of armor and half-tracks, their silhouettes ghostly under the pale dawn. The most powerful armored spearhead the Wehrmacht had assembled for the Ardennes Offensive now stood silent, immobile, strangled by emptiness. 67 tanks, nearly 150 half-tracks, and close to 5,000 men of Germany's elite Waffen-SS waited for orders that meant nothing without fuel. Around them the forest whispered, indifferent. The sound of metal contracting in the cold punctuated the stillness like the ticking of a distant clock. Every man knew what it meant. Without fuel, The drive to the Meuse was dead before it began. Peiper's eyes swept over the motionless column, steel giants that had once embodied the Reich's promise of unstoppable power. Now they were statues, frozen mid-charge, their camouflage netting stiff with frost. A few crewmen huddled around sputtering cigarette embers, faces hollow and gray. Others leaned against their vehicles, staring into the tree line as if searching for some unseen deliverance. A dispatch rider approached, motorcycle useless, pushing it through the snow. His face was red from the cold, his expression grim. "Herr Standartenführer," he reported, voice strained from exhaustion. "No fuel at Ligneuville. Americans blew the depot before we arrived." Peiper didn't answer immediately. He just stared past the man, his gaze tracing the serpentine road ahead that disappeared into the mist, toward Stavelot, toward the Meuse, toward a victory that was slipping further with every breath. He knelt, scooping a handful of frozen mud. It crumbled in his glove like brittle glass. "All this," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "And the Reich is brought to a halt by a drop of fuel." The words hung heavy, half lament, half curse. Behind him, engines occasionally turned over, a desperate attempt to keep the batteries alive, but each cough and sputter died quickly, swallowed by the cold. A crew chief shouted for antifreeze. Another cursed as his MG-42 jammed from frostbite in the chamber. Even the war horses of steel were freezing to death. From the tree line, the faint crack of small arms fire echoed. Scouts reporting contact somewhere ahead. The men stirred, instinctively reaching for weapons. Peiper turned his head, eyes narrowing. "Americans," he said flatly. "They'll have fuel." An officer stepped closer, hesitant. "Herr Standartenführer, even if we take it, can we move all this armor before they regroup?" Peiper looked up, the dawn light catching his face, hard, pale, carved from exhaustion and fury. "We move," he said coldly. "We take what we need, or we freeze here and rot like the rest of Germany." He climbed back onto the Tiger, scanning the frozen landscape that lay ahead. The forest no longer whispered. It watched. The snow carried the weight of thousands of boots, thousands of breaths, and a single unspoken truth. The mighty German offensive, the last gamble of the Reich, was already beginning to die in the cold. Through the morning mist, Peiper could see the faint outlines of Hansfeld, the small Belgian village the Americans had abandoned hours earlier. Fires still burned in oil drums beside the road. In the snow lay discarded rations, still steaming coffee, and rows of olive-drab jerry cans stacked neatly by a fence. It was as if the gods of war had left an offering. He walked toward the depot slowly, cautiously, half afraid it was a trick. The faint smell of gasoline cut through the cold. His adjutant pried open a can, dipped a gloved finger, and sniffed. "Benzin. High octane." For a moment, no one moved. Then shouts erupted, orders barked, boots clattering, the sudden frenzy of men who had glimpsed salvation. Engines were primed for refueling, hoses uncoiled, caps twisted off. Peiper stood among them, counting the cans. There were thousands, pyramids of steel, glinting under the weak morning sun. 50,000 gallons, he calculated. Enough to move the entire Kampfgruppe forward. Enough to reignite the offensive toward the Meuse River. Enough, perhaps, to change the course of the war. But even as that thought flickered, another followed. Colder, sharper. If the Americans could abandon such abundance, if they could leave behind what Germany guarded like treasure, what did that say about the balance of this war? He turned one of the jerry cans over in his hands. The paint was clean, the stamp still legible. U.S. Army, 1944. The edges were smooth, production flawless. The sheer quantity was staggering. To the Germans, fuel was gold, measured by the liter and rationed by decree. To the Americans, it was just another supply item, something so plentiful they could walk away from it. Peiper's thoughts drifted to Speer's report, delivered in that suffocating Berlin conference room 6 months earlier. He remembered the maps, the figures, the quiet desperation in the armaments minister's voice. "The synthetic plants are gone," Speer had said. "Without fuel, the Reich will grind to a halt." Leuna, Blechhammer, Brux, all turned to rubble by Allied bombers. In April, they had produced 175,000 tons. By September, barely 5. He could still see Hitler's face when Speer said it, veins tightening at the temples, eyes burning with denial. "Then we take it from the enemy," the Führer had snapped. "Our tanks will drink American gasoline." And now, here in the Ardennes, those words had become prophecies. Around him, the men worked feverishly. Pumps throbbed, engines roared to life, the air filled with the intoxicating scent of fuel and exhaust. For the first time in days, laughter broke through the cold. Some of the younger soldiers shouted to one another, half delirious, as if the smell of gasoline itself were victory. Peiper didn't share their elation. He stood motionless, staring at the distant road vanishing into the woods. The forest was quiet again, but not peaceful. It was holding its breath. He knew the Americans would return soon, and when they did, the battle for this fuel would decide who moved and who froze. He clenched his gloved fist around the metal handle of a jerry can. It was heavy, solid, filled with hope and irony. 50,000 gallons, he murmured. Enough to live one more day. The engines of the Tiger tanks began to rumble again, their deep growl echoing through the village like thunder rolling through the pines. Black smoke curled skyward, staining the pale horizon. Peiper turned toward the sound, his expression hardening. For now, the beast had breath again. But deep down he knew it was only borrowed life. Germany's entire petroleum output, including synthetic production and what little remained from Ploiesti, amounted to 33 million barrels a year. The United States refined 1.8 billion. The difference wasn't arithmetic. It was destiny. Now, standing in the middle of captured abundance, Peiper felt the weight of that arithmetic pressing on him like the cold itself. He ordered refueling to begin immediately. Men rolled drums, hauled hoses, splashed golden liquid into the throats of tanks. The smell of gasoline filled the air, a perfume of temporary hope. But even as engines roared back to life, Peiper couldn't shake the unease growing inside him. The fuel that promised survival also whispered humiliation. He stepped into the depot office, a small wooden building half collapsed from artillery shock. Papers littered the floor, some burned, others soaked from melted snow. A map of Europe hung crookedly on the wall, with bright red pins marking the Allied supply routes. He picked up one of the discarded American manifests lying on a desk, the ink crisp, the typewritten letters perfect. The papers were stamped with neat rows of numbers. Origin, Texas. Destination, New York. Transit, Liverpool, Normandy, Hansfeld. 6,000 miles of uninterrupted supply in less than 6 weeks. The efficiency was incomprehensible. He crushed the paper in his fist until it tore. "They have oceans," he muttered, "and we have drops." The words came out low, bitter, a confession no German officer dared make aloud. Outside, his men shouted with excitement as engines thundered again, the sound rolling through the forest like awakening giants. Frost cracked beneath the treads of refueled panthers and half-tracks. The forest echoed with mechanical resurrection. Yet every gallon they poured into their machines was another reminder that this was borrowed strength, American strength, temporarily fueling a dying empire. Peiper's adjutant appeared at the doorway, clipboard in hand, his expression a mix of pride and worry. Herr Standartenführer, the total is confirmed, 50,000 gallons. Peiper nodded slowly. How far does that take us? Perhaps 20 miles, 25 at most, the man admitted. To reach the Meuse, we'll need 65. Peiper said nothing. He stared out toward the armored line stretching down the snow-covered road, black steel against white silence. The realization gnawed at him. Even miracles had limits. He thought back to 2 days earlier, in the dim farmhouse at Tondorf. The air had been thick with tobacco and exhaustion as Sepp Dietrich, the veteran of every campaign since 1939, gave his commanders their final briefing. You will have enough fuel to reach the Meuse, he'd said, pausing for effect, if you capture enemy supplies. The room had fallen silent. Everyone understood what that meant. The entire operation rested not on logistics, but on luck. 31,000 gallons allotted to Kampfgruppe Peiper. Enough for 50 miles, on paper. But in truth, not even close. Now, here in Hansfeld, Peiper realized the offensive had been doomed by its own arithmetic from the start. The Reich no longer commanded industry or distance. It survived on chance and audacity. The men around him cheered as the tanks rumbled forward, but he heard something else beneath the noise, the ticking of a clock running out. He looked down once more at the crumpled American manifest in his hand. The paper was thin, fragile, and yet it represented power beyond measure. Peiper let it fall into the snow and watched as the wind caught it, tumbling it across the frozen ground like a leaf. Start the column, he said at last. His voice was calm, almost detached. We move while the gods still look away. At dawn on December 16th, the offensive had begun. The sky pulsed with the thunder of artillery. 2 hours of bombardment expended more shells than some entire divisions had fired in months. Columns of armor rolled westward through the forest, engines rumbling, exhaust plumes curling upward like smoke signals of defiance. But within hours, the illusion of momentum collided with the reality of logistics. Roads marked as highways. On German maps were narrow farm lanes choked with mud and snow. Tanks jammed behind trucks, trucks behind horse carts behind wreckage. Engines idled, burning fuel the Reich couldn't replace. At Lanzerath, a handful of American reconnaissance troops held up Peiper's entire spearhead for nearly 10 hours. 10 hours of idling engines meant hundreds of gallons gone. By the time his column reached Hansfeld, it had advanced barely 20 miles and consumed 40% of its allocation. The depot before him wasn't even a major facility, just a forward supply point for the 99th Infantry Division. And yet it contained more gasoline than some entire German corps had seen in half a year. The disparity defied comprehension. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann, one of Peiper's interpreters, examined shipping documents scattered across a desk. He had worked in imports before the war and could read English. It says here, he told Peiper quietly, this shipment came from Texas oil fields, through New York, then Liverpool, then across France. 6,000 miles in 6 weeks. Peiper stared at the pages for a long time, silent, then said only, we will never match this. Nearby, another soldier flipped through a stack of Stars and Stripes newspapers left behind by retreating Americans. The headline dated December 15th, 2 days earlier, celebrated the opening of a new fuel pipeline from Cherbourg to Verdun, capable of delivering 300,000 gallons per day. A single American pipeline delivered daily what his entire Kampfgruppe would use for an entire operation. The men refueled in silence now, their earlier joy replaced by a grim understanding. Every can they opened was proof of defeat deferred. Outside, dawn broke over the Ardennes, pale light spilling across endless rows of jerry cans. The engines of Peiper's Tigers rumbled back to life, spewing white exhaust into the frozen air. The sound should have been triumphant. Instead, it felt hollow, a borrowed heartbeat. Peiper mounted his tank again, scanning the valley ahead. The path to the Meuse lay open for the moment. But behind the smoke and frost lingered the truth that could not be refueled away. They were fighting an enemy who could afford to lose what Germany could not dream of possessing. As the column began to move once more, snowflakes drifted down like ashes. The offensive was alive again, but the clock of fuel and fate had already begun to tick. The column moved west, engines roaring through the narrow valley roads. Exhaust fumes mixed with morning mist, the sound of steel treads grinding against ice echoing through the forest. Civilians watched from shuttered windows, faces pale and wordless as the black columns of Waffen SS armor thundered past. To them, it was as if the old ghost of 1940 had returned, the Blitzkrieg reborn. But the men inside those tanks knew better. Every mile forward was an act of faith measured in gallons. Fuel trucks, commandeered from the captured American depot, rumbled along the rear, their loads sloshing dangerously close to empty. Every few kilometers another vehicle would sputter and die, its tank run dry. Mechanics would push it off the road and siphon what little remained into others. There was no time to repair, no resources to waste. Movement was life. Stopping was death. Peiper's radio crackled with constant updates, delays, blockages, shortages. Bridges blown by retreating Americans forced endless detours. Roads clogged with refugees slowed columns to a crawl. The air was filled with curses and the grinding frustration of engines idling uselessly. By noon, the first reports came in. The Americans were destroying their own fuel depots ahead of the German advance. Columns of black smoke rose in the distance, pillars of flame that marked the end of every German hope. Peiper's officers watched in disbelief as thousands of gallons went up in fire. "They burn what we would die for," one muttered. Peiper said nothing. There was nothing left to say. At Stavelot, his men captured another cache, trucks, jeeps, and nearly 10,000 gallons of fuel. It felt like reprieve, but even that victory carried its own poison. The Americans had left the fuel in perfect condition, as if to mock them. On one drum someone had scrawled in chalk, "Too little, too late." The irony was sharper than frost. In Berlin, Hitler still believed the offensive would reach Antwerp. He envisioned divisions sweeping across the Meuse, cutting the Allied armies in two, forcing negotiation. But here, in the frozen valleys of Belgium, reality was measured not in kilometers or corps, but in liters and drops. By nightfall, Peiper's Kampfgruppe was stretched thin, too far from supply, too deep in enemy territory, too starved to retreat. His map was marked with red arrows that no longer meant anything. The original plan called for the 6th Panzer Army to break through to the Meuse in 3 days. It was now the 3rd day, and they had advanced barely 30 miles. The enemy lines were stiffening, air support returning as the skies cleared, and fuel gauges again sinking towards zero. At La Glaise, Peiper halted what remained of his column. Around him stood 22 tanks, half-tracks scarred and frozen, crews huddled around engine heat. They had begun the offensive with nearly twice that number. He stared at the remaining fuel list. Enough for 20 kilometers, maybe less. Beyond that lay open roads and American armor. The radio brought worse news. Kampfgruppe Hansen to the north had also run dry. Kampfgruppe Nittel was pinned down near Stoumont. The roads eastward were clogged with wreckage and abandoned vehicles. There was no going back. The Americans were closing in fast now, their Shermans and Pershings fanning out across the ridges. For them, the war was a logistical miracle. Endless convoys bringing fuel, ammunition, and food. For Peiper, each move forward now risked the last drop. He ordered a perimeter defense around La Glaise. Tanks were positioned to guard every approach, their engines cold, but their guns still ready. The village became a fortress of exhaustion and pride. That night, in the dim light of a flickering lantern, Peiper studied a captured American field map. It showed fuel lines, pipelines running underground from the Normandy beaches all the way to the front. He traced them with his finger, following the artery of supply that fed an entire army. It was a web of abundance the Germans could never recreate. Their logistics depended on horse carts and dwindling synthetic plants. The Americans had pipelines and oceans. Outside, snow began to fall again, silent and heavy. The sound of artillery rumbled in the distance, American guns zeroing in. Each explosion echoed like the tick of a clock counting down. By morning, the first shells fell on La Glaise. The town shook under the bombardment. Peiper's men fired back, but it was hopeless. Their fuel was gone, their ammunition low, their communications shattered. Tanks were positioned as stationary bunkers, unable to move but still defiant. The battle turned from attack to survival. By December 24th, Christmas Eve, the Kampfgruppe was surrounded. Peiper gathered his officers inside the church basement that served as headquarters. The air smelled of oil and damp stone. Candles flickered over tired faces. Outside, snow drifted past the stained glass windows, glowing faintly red from the fires in the distance. "We have no more fuel," his adjutant reported quietly. "Not a single drop." Peiper nodded slowly. The words were no surprise. The offensive had begun with hope and ended in arithmetic. That night, American loudspeakers called for surrender. Peiper refused. "We hold," he said simply, "until there is nothing left to hold with." But even he knew that the end was written not by courage or command, but by numbers. The Germans had entered the Ardennes with 3,000 tanks and assault guns. They lost more than 700 within 2 weeks, many not to battle, but to fuel starvation. The Reich had bet its last reserves on an illusion of mobility. The reality was immobility. As the last rounds were fired, Peiper gave the order to destroy the remaining vehicles. One by one, tanks were set alight, their ammunition cooking off in bursts that lit the night sky. Flames reflected in the snow like dying embers of a dream. The air filled with the sound of cracking steel and collapsing treads. When the fires died down, the men slipped out under the cover of darkness, abandoning the wreckage that had once been the spearhead of the Reich. They moved silently through the forest, cold and exhausted, leaving behind a graveyard of machines. By dawn, La Glaise was silent except for the hiss of cooling metal. American forces entered cautiously, weapons raised. What they found stunned them. Dozens of burned-out tanks, destroyed trucks, and thousands of empty fuel cans scattered like bones. On one wall, written in soot, someone had scrawled, "Kein Benzin, kein Krieg, no fuel, no war." Among the wreckage, a single Tiger tank stood almost intact, its massive barrel pointing skyward. It had been abandoned, out of fuel, but otherwise unscathed. The crew had walked away into the snow. That tank remains there to this day, a monument to the futility of power without supply. For the Americans who advanced through the Ardennes, the sight was surreal. They had fought men as fierce as any on earth, yet those men had been defeated not by strategy or bravery, but by arithmetic, by the invisible hand of logistics. The Germans had planned for courage to compensate for fuel. The Americans had planned for fuel to multiply courage. Only one equation could hold. Peiper and a handful of survivors eventually made it back through the lines, walking for days through snow and forest. They carried no weapons, no vehicles, no hope, only the silence of men who had glimpsed the truth of modern war. That industry, not ideology, decides history. The Ardennes fell silent in early January. The guns that had roared through the forests faded into distant thunder, replaced by the groan of recovery, cranes lifting wrecks, trucks hauling bodies, engineers clearing frozen roads. The snow had swallowed the scars, but beneath it lay the corpses of ambition and illusion. American units moved cautiously through the abandoned German lines. They expected mines, ambushes, the last gasps of a desperate army. What they found instead was absence. Burnt armor, frozen horses, fields littered with empty fuel drums. For miles, the same scene repeated. Hulking machines sitting cold and lifeless, their barrels blackened, their tracks half buried in snow. The air smelled faintly of oil and defeat. A lieutenant from the 30th Infantry Division wrote in his diary, "They had everything but fuel. They fought until their engines died. Then they walked." He had never seen such precision in destruction. Tanks positioned perfectly for defense, yet unable to move an inch. It was as if an invisible force had frozen the entire German army in place. When U.S. intelligence officers compiled reports from captured areas, the numbers told a story more brutal than any battle. The Wehrmacht had launched the Ardennes Offensive with barely enough fuel for 5 days of sustained combat. Every mile depended on capturing Allied supplies. Every delay, a blown bridge, a traffic jam, a skirmish, drained the offensive like a punctured artery. Within a week, half the armored vehicles were immobilized, abandoned, or destroyed for lack of gasoline. One American quartermaster calculated that the Allied forces in Western Europe consumed over 300,000 gallons of fuel every day and replaced it easily. The Germans, by contrast, scraped the bottom of barrels, siphoned from civilian cars, melted snow for radiator water, and prayed for miracles. The miracle never came. German soldiers captured during the retreat spoke with the same quiet disbelief. "We were told the Americans had shortages too," one confessed. "But they left more fuel behind in one village than we saw in an entire campaign." Another described the moment they found an abandoned American kitchen truck filled with butter, meat, and coffee. "We thought it was propaganda. It wasn't." The disparity was total, not just in fuel, but in everything. American units carried spare parts, winter clothing, medical kits, and rations for weeks. German troops wrapped their feet in rags and burned furniture for warmth. The U.S. Army could build bridges faster than the Wehrmacht could blow them. Supply had become a strategy. Logistics had become victory. In the ruins of Stoumont, an American engineer named Captain Robert Haynes studied the burned remains of a Panther tank. The vehicle's armor was formidable, its guns superior, but the interior was blackened. The fuel lines melted away. He ran his hand over the steel and murmured to no one in particular, "This is what happens when math runs out." A correspondent nearby wrote it down. Months later, the phrase would circulate among U.S. staff officers as shorthand for the Battle of the Bulge. In Germany, word of the failure reached the Führer's headquarters like a slow poison. The official reports spoke of tactical setbacks, temporary fuel shortages, and logistical difficulties. But inside the General Staff offices, men who had once worshipped numbers now avoided them. They knew the truth. The Reich had run out of energy, literally and metaphorically. Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, reviewed production charts that looked like death certificates. Aviation fuel output was down to a fraction of 1943 levels. Synthetic plants operated at night to avoid Allied bombers, producing barely enough for 1 week of combat every month. The rail system was shattered, refineries in ruins, and coal reserves trapped behind advancing Soviet lines. There was nothing left to shift, nothing left to refine. He wrote in his notes that month, "Our armies now move at the pace of exhaustion." It was not rhetoric, it was arithmetic. Back on the front, American officers studying captured maps began to understand the scale of what had happened. The German plan had depended on capturing Allied fuel depots. Without them, the offensive was doomed before the first shell was fired. A single miscalculation, one road blocked, one bridge delayed, turned momentum into paralysis. Historians later called it a failure of logistics, but for the men who lived it, it felt like watching an empire dissolve in real time. The most elite soldiers in Europe had advanced into the heart of the enemy and found their strength evaporating gallon by gallon. For the Americans, the lesson was clear. They had not just won by courage or numbers, but by movement, the constant, unstoppable flow of material. Their trucks and fuel lines were as decisive as their guns. Eisenhower understood it instinctively. "The fuel won this war," he said quietly to his staff after the Ardennes. "Gasoline and those who deliver it." The men of the Red Ball Express had proved it months earlier. Thousands of black American drivers hauling fuel and ammunition across France under fire, day and night. Their convoys stretched for miles, engines roaring through rain and mud. They kept Patton's tanks rolling when nothing else could. By the time the Ardennes began, their network had become the backbone of Allied logistics, a living artery that no blitz could cut. Peiper's men, trapped in La Glaise, had faced the opposite. Their entire future depended on scavenging from that same system. The irony was perfect and merciless. The same American abundance that sustained one army had starved the other by comparison. In January, American photographers filmed the wreckage around La Glaise. The footage shows silent tanks, burned villages, and rows of fuel drums scattered like a message. The narrator's voice, calm and precise, said, "This is how Germany's last offensive ended, not in battle, but in shortage." For the German officers who survived, the memory of that campaign never faded. Years later, when questioned after the war, many spoke not of strategy or tactics, but of fuel. General Hasso von Manteuffel said it plainly. "We lost the war when we lost the oil." Peiper himself, in captivity, described Hansfeld, that miraculous depot, as both his salvation and his doom. "It was the moment I realized the truth," he said. "If they can leave that much behind, then they can never be defeated." Across occupied Germany, civilians began to understand it too. Coal trains no longer ran. Electric lights flickered out. Factories stood cold. The once mighty Reich, built on steel and fire, was suffocating under scarcity. Meanwhile, in the American camps across the Rhine, there was abundance even in routine. Soldiers cleaned their rifles with gasoline, lit cigarettes from fuel drums, and joked about liquid gold. It was casual extürsches, but it carried a message that no propaganda could match. The war was no longer about courage. It was about capacity. By the time Allied forces crossed into Germany in March, resistance had become symbolic. The Wehrmacht still fought with precision and courage, But its machines were ghosts, tanks dragged by horses, trucks that never moved, aircraft hidden under trees with empty tanks. And behind it all, a simple truth lingered in every smoking village and frozen road. The Reich had built its empire on conquest, but America had built its war on logistics. One was fire, the other was infrastructure. And in the modern world, infrastructure always wins. By February 1945, the Ardennes was no longer a battlefield, but a graveyard of machines. Snow melted into black mud streaked with oil. Villagers returned to what was left of their homes, walking among the rusting hulks of Tigers and Shermans that sat half-submerged in thawing earth. The war had moved eastward, but its ghosts stayed behind. Frozen steel monuments to ambition, failure, and fuel. American engineers came to study the wrecks. They measured impact holes, photographed melted armor, and cataloged each burned-out tank like a museum specimen. But what interested them most was not the damage, it was the absence. Empty fuel tanks, dry lines, vehicles abandoned intact because they could no longer move. The offensive that was supposed to change history had been defeated not by battle, but by combustion ratios and supply curves. For the Germans who survived, the retreat through Belgium was a walk through collapse. Columns stretched for miles, men dragging their feet through slush, faces gray from hunger and smoke. Horses pulled carts loaded with the wounded, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. Behind them, the thunder of Allied artillery rolled closer each day. In the skies above, P-47 Thunderbolts prowled endlessly, their fuel tanks gleaming silver in the sunlight, a cruel reminder that their enemies flew on abundance. When Peiper and his remnants crossed back into German lines, there was no welcome, no ceremony. They looked like ghosts. The once proud black uniforms of the Waffen-SS were torn and stained. Their boots were wrapped in rags, their belts replaced by rope. The headquarters officer who debriefed them didn't ask about tactics. He asked about fuel. "How much did you recover?" Peiper's answer was a single word: none. The report went straight to Berlin. There, inside the Führer bunker, the last illusion flickered and died. The Ardennes Offensive had been more than a battle. It had been Germany's final gamble on motion, the belief that one last strike could reverse time. Instead, it had exposed the naked truth. The Reich could no longer move. Everywhere the signs of immobility spread. Trains stopped mid-route, locomotives frozen in place. Armored divisions were reduced to infantry. Luftwaffe pilots sat idle beside their grounded aircraft, staring at empty drums. The Reich's war machine, once the terror of continents, had become a static monument to exhaustion. In the cities, people burned furniture for heat. Coal deliveries ceased. Factory chimneys no longer smoked. A gray stillness settled over everything. For a nation built on the mythology of perpetual motion, of panzers rolling, bombers soaring, banners marching, stillness was death. In March, American forces crossed the Rhine. They did it not with fanfare, but with the calm efficiency of a system that knew it could not fail. Floating bridges went up overnight, supply convoys rolled without pause, and fuel lines followed like veins of fire feeding a living organism. The tempo was mechanical, unstoppable, the industrial heartbeat of victory. When Eisenhower visited the front, he said almost nothing. He simply watched as convoys stretched from horizon to horizon. A reporter near him later recalled his expression, not pride, but certainty. He understood that wars are not won by who fights hardest, but by who can fight longest. And America could fight forever. In the shattered towns of the Ruhr, German officers watched that same certainty unfold. They saw endless American trucks, each loaded with drums marked Standard Oil and Shell, each one part of an empire of logistics that spanned oceans. For them, it was a revelation disguised as routine. They had built their strategy on daring. The Americans built theirs on mathematics. Peiper, awaiting transfer from his field unit, spent his final days of the war writing in silence. His notes, later found by interrogators, were brief, stripped of ideology. One line stood out among the rest. "We were trained to command courage. They commanded infrastructure. That is the future of war." The future had arrived, and it spoke the language of supply chains and refineries. When Germany finally collapsed in May, the surrender was almost anticlimactic. The armies that had once stormed across Europe now laid down their weapons before enemies whose greatest weapon was organization. The factories of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago had defeated the philosophy of total war more completely than any battlefield ever could. Across the ruins, American soldiers moved quietly. They did not shout or celebrate. They simply kept moving. Engineers repaired roads. Quartermasters rerouted fuel. The same precision that had conquered was now rebuilding. Even in victory, the machine ran smoothly. For the Germans, the realization was existential. Their myth of the invincible warrior had been destroyed by the reality of the industrial worker, the anonymous men behind machines, behind the convoys, behind the pipelines. No uniform, no medal, no speech could compete with that. In a small village near the Rhine, an elderly German mechanic stood watching an American convoy pass. He had once worked on Panzer engines and knew their hunger for fuel. As the endless line of trucks rolled by, each carrying drums of gasoline, he whispered to his grandson, "They are rich not because they conquer. They conquer because they are rich." The boy didn't understand, but the world that was coming would. Decades later, historians would dissect the Battle of the Bulge, its tactics, its command failures, its human cost. But beneath all the analysis, one truth remained untouched. Modern war is not a contest of soldiers, but of systems. And in 1944, the most efficient system in human history had gone to war. The final image of the Ardennes exists in film reels now stored in archives. Black and white footage of American soldiers walking through La Glaise. The camera pans slowly across the silent Tiger tank left behind by Peiper's men. Snow drifts around it, coating its turret like ash. A single American private climbs onto the hull and peers inside, a flashlight beam cutting through darkness. The tank is empty. No crew, no fuel, no motion, just silence. The soldier lingers for a moment, then steps down and walks away. Behind him, the tank looms like a monument, not to power, but to the absence of it. The wind howls through the hollow barrel, making a sound like a breath, the last breath of a machine that once believed it could outrun history. The camera holds still, snow falling heavier now, muffling everything. No music, no voiceover, just the quiet of winter over steel. Then the frame fades to black. And that is where the war ends. Not in the roar of engines, but in their silence. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, the silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like suspension, as if the world itself was waiting to understand what it had done. Germany lay still, dissected by its conquerors, each zone of occupation marked not by flags, but by logistics maps and fuel depots. The Americans arrived not as raiders, but as administrators of movement. Convoys rolled east with the same precision that had brought them across France, trucks carrying rations, medicine, and fuel, this time not to destroy, but to sustain. Every depot, every pipeline, Every stretch of repaired rail spoke the same mechanical language that had won the war. In the villages of the Ruhr and along the Rhine, civilians watched this choreography unfold. They had grown used to scarcity, to the rattle of empty shelves and the taste of ersatz coffee. Now they saw abundance return, but not their own. American soldiers drove jeeps that seemed always full, wore uniforms that were always clean, smoked cigarettes that never ran out. Even in defeat, the comparison was unbearable. For the captured German officers held in temporary compounds, realization came slowly, then all at once. They had been told they fought against chaos, against decadence, against a world that had lost its discipline. But in captivity, they discovered that discipline itself had defeated them. Not martial discipline, but industrial discipline. One colonel, formerly attached to Guderian's staff, was recorded telling an interrogator, "You have created war without emotion. We created emotion without endurance." His words summed up the quiet lesson of 1945. The machinery of war was no longer about bravery. It was about continuity. The side that could keep its engines turning longest owned the future. In the camps, German POWs stared in disbelief as American guards received mail from home every week, ate fresh bread, and listened to radios that played swing music through loudspeakers. For many of them, it was their first encounter with the full reach of American logistics. They understood now that what had rolled across Europe wasn't merely an army, it was an entire civilization in motion. One prisoner later recalled, "It was as if they had brought their homeland with them. Their trucks were their cities." Back in Berlin, the once mighty capital had been reduced to a skeleton of stone and dust. Yet even amid ruin, the Americans and British established order through movement. Supply chains of reconstruction. The same motor pools that had supplied Patton's army now supplied bricks and medicine. Fuel flowed again, but this time through pipelines of recovery. The Red Ball Express had ended, but its spirit lived on in a quieter form. Operation Vittles, the Berlin airlift, years later, would become its echo. The same logistical genius turned toward mercy instead of conquest. Peiper's notes, preserved by Allied archivists, were read by American officers in Frankfurt. They were struck by his precision, the detached way he described the failure of German supply and the success of American redundancy. He had written, "We lost, not because they were stronger, but because they could make mistakes and continue. We could not afford one." That sentence became a cornerstone in post-war military education. West Point cadets studied it as a case of logistical inflexibility. Eisenhower himself reportedly underlined the phrase in a briefing copy. By 1946, Germany was learning the same lesson in reconstruction. Its railways were rebuilt under Allied supervision. American engineers introduced new systems for fuel distribution, civilian trucking, and standardized containers, the early seeds of what would become the European economic miracle. What had once crushed Germany now rebuilt it. In a small Bavarian town, a former Wehrmacht mechanic named Müller went back to work, repairing engines for American trucks now leased to German contractors. The same grease, the same wrenches, only the purpose had changed. One afternoon, as he tightened a bolt on a Dodge engine, he paused and said to his apprentice, "We are now maintaining what defeated us." The boy nodded, unsure whether that was shame or progress. Elsewhere, in the archives of the U.S. Army in Heidelberg, officers sorted through captured German reports. Among them were detailed breakdowns of fuel usage during the Ardennes. The math was brutal. Germany had launched an offensive that required 3 million gallons of fuel per day, while possessing less than 1 million in total reserve. Every column that advanced was destined to stop. It was not strategy. It was arithmetic. Historians would later say the war had been decided long before D-Day. In the oil fields, in the factories, in the convoys across the Atlantic. The fighting had merely been the visible part of a decision already made by tonnage and horsepower. By 1948, the ruins of the Reich were humming again, trains moving, factories smoking, but now under a new discipline: production for peace. The same logistical genius that had supplied destruction was redirected into rebuilding Europe. American officers called it the long convoy home. In one remarkable scene recorded by a journalist, a group of German engineers stood watching an American transport column leaving Frankfurt. The trucks bore the insignia of the Marshall Plan. One of them said quietly, "They have turned their war machine into a peace machine." His colleague replied, "Maybe that was always the real victory, not ending the war, but proving that their system could create anything." The system. That was the word that lingered. The war had begun as a contest of ideologies, but it had ended as a contest of systems, one that valued precision over passion, output over rhetoric. The victors were not the most ruthless, but the most organized. As the decade closed, those who had survived the Ardennes began to fade into anonymity. The great tank aces, the logistics officers, the engineers, their names disappeared into textbooks and archives. But the lessons remained, encoded in the infrastructure of the modern world. Every highway, every supply network, every global shipping schedule owed something to that terrible efficiency learned in the 1940s. In a museum outside Bastogne, an American veteran visited the preserved wreck of a German Tiger tank. He was an old man now, walking with a cane, his uniform replaced by a gray coat. He stood before the silent machine and whispered, "You were stronger, but we were steadier." The wind moved through the forest around him, the same wind that had howled over the snow in 1944. He turned and walked away slowly, leaving the tank behind in its cage of glass and steel. Outside, modern trucks rumbled along the highway, civilian descendants of the Red Ball Express. Their cargoes were not shells, but groceries, electronics, furniture. Yet the rhythm was the same: endless motion, uninterrupted supply. History, it seemed, had chosen its side long ago, the side that never ran out of fuel. And as dusk fell over the Ardennes once more, the last light touched the rusted hulls of tanks half buried in moss. The forest reclaimed them inch by inch, vines creeping over metal, time sealing the wounds of ambition. But somewhere, deep within that stillness, the faint echo of engines could still be imagined, not of war, but of endurance. The same endurance that had carried the convoys across France, across generations, across history itself. Then the forest went silent again, as it had been before men built machines. Only the wind remained, moving softly through trees that had once watched nations burn, whispering to the dead below. A reminder that all empires end, but the rhythm of supply never stops.